Hi everyone, welcome to this book discussion with Professor Surinder Singh Jodhka on his latest book, The Indian Village, Rural Lives in the 21st Century on Doing Sociology. Very quickly to introduce our illustrious speaker, Surinder Singh Jodhka is a professor of sociology at the Center for the Study of Social Systems, CSSS, Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, New Delhi. He is also an affiliate senior fellow at the Center for Humanities and Social Sciences, CHS, New Delhi. He researches on different dimensions of social inequalities, old and new, and the processes of their reproduction. Empirical focus of his work has been the dynamics of caste and the varied modes of its articulation with the nature of social and economic change in neoliberal India, studies of agrarian social change and contemporary rural India, and the political sociology community identities. His publications include Interrogating India's Modernity, edited and published by OUP 2013, Caste, Oxford India Short Introductions, OUP 2012, Village Society, edited Orion Black Swan 2012, Community and Identities, Contemporary Discourses on Culture and Politics in India, edited Sage 2001. He is also the editor of the Rutledge India book series on religion and citizenship. He is among the first recipients of the ICSSR Amartya Sen Award for Distinguished Social Scientist for the year 2012. In today's conversation, we are going to discuss his very recent book, The Indian Village, Rural Lives in the 21st Century, which has been published by the Aleph Book Company in 2023. Sir, I welcome you to this discussion on doing sociology and thank you for giving us the time and discussing your new book. So let me begin actually by asking you to talk a little bit about the context in which this book is written so that, our listeners and viewers are familiar with how the idea of the book itself emerged.
Obviously, there are always many reasons why you write a book. And for me, it's a kind of different book because so far, whatever I have published, it has been kind of written for my fellow academics. Those who are doing research, and those writings are based on either my own research or edited volumes, which again carry research papers. This book is slightly different because it has been published by Aleph, which is kind of, they would put it as non-fiction, and it is from kind of, urban educated audience. It's not that it is not academic, but it's not written in that style. It is kind of more in a narrative style, where I try to, in some sense, bring together my own understanding of rural lives in India. And this is something that I've been working on for many years. My earliest work, my PhD scholarship dissertation, also was on agrarian processes, and that was in the late 1980s. My field work. After that, I have done field work in my villages again after 20 years. Besides, I've also done fieldwork in that was in Haryana. Then I did fieldwork in Punjab. I've also done fieldwork in Gujarat and Maharashtra, not really Maharashtra, Gujarat, Himachal Pradesh, and Bihar. These are the states where I have done my own work, and all that is published in one form or the other. So sometime back, we had edited this book. It's called Indian Village, India's Villages in the 21st Century. And this book was published by Oxford University Press. This book was in a sense sequel to M.N. Srinivas' book, which was kind of India's Villages. And all those essays in that book were published in Economic Weekly. I mean, these were early ethnographic studies of the village. So then, we have this narrative of urbanization, which says that with developmental process, with modernization, village tends to, in some sense, decline and disappear with process of urbanization and with various other kind of aspects of developmental process. So, and this was also being, in some sense, proposed, or in the policy narratives. For example, we have categories like urban or urbanity, where you are kind of already thinking that, rural doesn't exist any longer. What you have is the city and something which is kind of still left behind in between. And there were other people who were saying that, rural is a place where everyone wants to run away from and stuff like that. So my own empirical work was, in some sense, and empirical work being done by other people, was actually not conforming to that simplistic modernization theory kind of narrative. And so we kind of put together, this was a book published in 2019, edited by me and Edward Simpson, who was at that time Director of South Asian Studies in SOAS. They had taken up a project where they revisited the villages where scholars from Britain had come and done their ethnographic work in 1940s and 50s. So these studies were all talking about villages that still exist, and rurality is still thriving. Not that things don't change, they have been changing. But if you have to talk about village, we also need to revisit village. And not only revisit village, but we also need to revision ruralities, right? When we were talking about sociology and anthropology in 1940s and 50s, there was a particular context of decolonization where we were framed by the white man, by Eurocentric social theorists and stuff like that, where India was seen as backward country, and therefore everyone lived in villages. So there was a narrative which itself was very problematic. So that was the intellectual kind of background that I thought, this is something that we need to talk about. For example, if we were to look at the empirical processes, and this is something that I start with in the new book, agriculture has declined globally, right? Only 4% of global GDP is contributed by agriculture today, right? In the recent, last 5-10 years, whatever the estimates. But if you look at rural population globally, it hasn't declined. It has declined in relative terms, but it was only recently in 2008 or 9 that globally urban population was more than rural population, but the absolute size of rural population was also higher than ever before, right? If you were to compare, say, the early decades of 20th century with, say, 2021, rural population has globally been doubled or something like that. I have those kind of data in my book. And if you look at Indian context, again, we are a large urban population, in the sense that 35% of India is very large, right, in absolute size. But if you look at rural population, it hasn't declined. It has actually, during the same period, gone up by 4 times, right? So even if you have 60% or 65% of Indians living in rural areas, it's not a small number. In absolute terms, it is much more than ever before. So village population demographics has not declined at all. There is process of urbanization. Some of those who are living now in cities, they have migrated from rural areas, but there are different trajectories and patterns of migrations. And those migrations do not lead to urbanization, right? So the kind of circular migration that we have. And then the third was kind of, a political context. And that was the way in response to farmers' movement in 1920, 21, when we all saw a large number of farmers from Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, Rajasthan, and also from other parts of India, they protested against the newly introduced farm laws. And many of them came and sat on the borders of Delhi. And we were all talking about agriculture. We were talking about farmers. We were talking about agrarian studies. And you could see a very contrasting difference. On the one hand, you had the urban middle class, people like us in some sense, speaking in television studios and completely ignorant, and they had, the only thing they had was judgments, that basically, passing judgments that these are ignorant people at best, and at worst they are motivated because they don't want India to progress, without looking at the contents of farm laws, without listening to what they were trying to say. And when I went to these dharnas, and many of us actually did, you could also see them online through kind of live telecast of their programs. And these were, as I describe in this book, these were not ordinary peasants. I mean, nobody's ever ignorant in that sense, but these were very articulate, and I describe them as cosmopolitan kisan. They were not only articulate about their demands, they were also sitting on those dharnas and understand what these farm laws were. They mobilized their own young people who had done degrees in law, who had studied history. They were talking about corporate capitalism. They were talking about agricultural markets. They were talking about environment. They were talking about all the other problems that they are facing. They were also trying to be inclusive. They were trying to mobilize women farmers and bring them to border. They recognized caste question. And they were such knowledgeable and kind of critical actors, and compare them with these urban middle class, kind of judgmental leader intellectuals, and people who were spokespersons of different kinds of constituencies, and almost most of them were in some sense trying to repeat the same thing. And even some professional economists, they confess that they had not actually read laws. Those were available very easily online, and you could, and these are short texts. So they didn't bother. They just kind of had an assumption that if the farm laws are for reforming agriculture, opening agriculture to private sector, why should anyone object? If they're objecting because they have some vested interests, either political or they just want state patronage. They wanted state patronage, but there is a reason for that. So there's a large kind of mass of people who live in rural areas. And in case of India, they also depend on agriculture. I mean, that's a separate matter, how much they depend on agriculture, which we can discuss. But at the same time, these are their lives. And they did not want bureaucrats and economists and politicians sitting in Delhi without any knowledge of their context decide about them. So they were speaking like citizens. They were speaking well-informed actors who were willing to negotiate, who were willing to discuss with whosoever went to them. And there was this urban middle class, which was kind of sounding very ignorant and arrogant at the same time. So I thought that, we also need to communicate with the larger middle class that, rural is not something that is dying or not something that is already dead. Rural is very much alive. Rural is thriving in some sense. And we need to revise our understanding of rural as well as urban. We also need to revise our understanding of what social change and development is. We also need to revise our understanding of ourselves. What we are saying could also be just a kind of hegemonic narratives given to us by somebody, and we kind of take them uncritically. So the actual reality of social life, urban life, rural life is far more complex. And this book tries to kind of, explain those complexities. I've tried to make it more accessible than one would do academic writings. And I hope, those who read it, they would kind of find it useful.
Right. Thank you, sir, for laying out the context of the book. And while you were talking about the context, you did mention about the changing rural society. And when we talk about change, we do know that there is also this changing idea of the village, right? How do you think the idea of the village is changing? Could you also give some examples to illustrate this?
Yeah, actually, if you were to kind of look at the structure of the book, I have spent a lot of time, first 2-3 chapters are precisely on the question of the idea of village, because the problem also lies in the manner in which we frame village and city. And this framing of village and city is not simply a framing or description of something that is out there. I mean, in sociology, we have this notion of sui generis realities, and rural is sui generis, urban is sui generis. So there's one type of society, and then there's another kind of society, or there are rural communities and urban societies, and there is this process of change. So this is what kind of became the starting point for village studies in India, and that also continues to be our common sense through which we think of village as a category. Now, this is kind of construction which is done by the urban middle classes at some level. That is the space where it is reproduced. But historically, the idea of village also has its own trajectory, and that trajectory also has its own politics. And that politics, in some sense, begins with the colonial concept of rule trying to produce what Bernard Cohn calls as different forms of knowledge. And these knowledges were produced about India not to explain and describe India. Those knowledges were produced to also frame theories about Indian society or Indian population through which they could legitimize their presence in India, right? So they came to India because India was a place where they should do business. We all know the first people to come here were the British East India Company. They came here to do business. And where would you go to do business? You would not go to do business in a land of village republics where everyone is self-sufficient and subsistent. So that was not the empirical reality. The empirical reality, in fact, was that India was, or this region at that time, the word India itself has its own trajectory, so that's part of the problem. But they have come to this region, starting with, say, southern Western India, places like Kerala and Goa, where they want to do trade in spice. And then they realize that India is a wealthy place. We all know, we've all read in our school textbooks that how India was at one time Sone ki chidiya and stuff like that. So there was a lot of wealth in India. And this is now confirmed by people like Piketty, that if you look at the volume of wealth globally, historically, in the 16th, 17th century, 18th century, the wealth was more concentrated in regions like India and China rather than the West. So India was not a land of village republics. India had large, thriving, vibrant, urban life. And actually, if you look at the estimates, which again I've cited in my book, the urban population, in whatever way it was understood, or it is now understood by demographers and historians of urban life, India had something like 15 to 18% of its population living in these so-called urban centers. They were pilgrimage cities. They were places where rulers lived. There were also marketing centers. There was a variety of urban centers in India. And the total population of urban India would have been much higher than the total population of just the urban India would have been much higher than the total population of Great Britain, right? We were perhaps more urban than Europe was. I mean, you can count number of cities starting with Peshawar and Rawalpindi and Lahore, going down to Thiruvananthapuram and Vijayawada and Pune and Hyderabad, all across, from west to east, north to south. So they were not only urban centers, but also they were urban imaginations. And rural life was always connected to the urban life, and rural was not in some sense insulated or isolated. But they produce this narrative, and that narrative then becomes a part of what we call as theories of social change. That there are types of societies, there are traditional societies, backward societies, underdeveloped countries, underdeveloped regions, and then there are advanced cultures, advanced societies, developed countries, modern day society, and that is all in the West. And then we are clubbed together as what we these days call as Global South. Earlier it was called as Third World or Developing World. And that becomes the not only dominant narrative, it also becomes a hegemonic narrative. So the word hegemonic is very important because the narrative is constructed by the colonial ruler and later on by the post-Cold War Western academy. But we also accept it, right? The elite of regions like India, our ruling elite, but also people like us. I started teaching development studies when I began to teach sociology, and everyone kind of, talked about development. Social sciences were to bring about development. So underlying assumption was not that India had been made rural by the colonial policies. India had been made underdeveloped by colonial policy. The underlying assumption was that there is a natural state of underdevelopment, natural state when everyone lives in rural areas, and then with industrialization, cities emerge. Yes, industrialization brings in a new kind of urban, but that doesn't mean that urban doesn't exist earlier. It also doesn't mean that everyone who lives in the village practices agriculture. So the way our census systems are kind of evolved by economists and statisticians, they are also very problematic. So the moment you talk about rural, you think of only agrarian occupations as the rural occupation. Well, we all know that, in Indian villages, you had carpenters, you had blacksmiths, you had people who were engineers in weaving shoes and various other kinds of artisan products. And that was technology. That was very sophisticated technology, weaving clothes And you heard about those saris of Dhaka that you can fold, very sophisticated silk saris which you can fold them and put them in a matchbox. Or even now you have those carpet weaving technologies in Kashmir, and which are very light carpets, and people come from West and buy one carpet for like ₹500,000. So these were indigenous technologies, and these technologies were sophisticated, the crafts, and you had architecture, you have temples, and Taj Mahals. So we were engineers, we were craftsmen and women, we were also agriculturists. And Indian agriculture, like agriculture elsewhere, was a very vibrant and productive and diverse enterprise. Spices of India were kind of very high value, but there were many other crops that were produced depending on climatic regions, depending on experience of people. So this was a very complicated kind of agrarian and urban regions. And agriculture was always, at some level, also a mobile and trade activity. So it was also always actively interacting with urban life and urban economy. Otherwise, urban economy could not function. How did we support the power, right? The colonial ruler, the Mughal rulers, or the other rulers in different regions of the subcontinent. All of them depended on what we call as land revenue. So land was producing surplus. But these notions, which are colonial constructs, they become kind of sources of knowing about India, even for somebody like Karl Marx. And then Karl Marx kind of also produces a theory of Indian underdevelopment through the idea of Asiatic mode of production. And it also comes into classical thinking about social change, as Indian village and Indian caste system is often cited as a good example of a traditional society which from the ancient time until the British colonial rulers remained stagnant and internally peaceful. There's also romantic imagination built into this, but that was complete lie, right? And it was being done, as Bernard Cohn says, to legitimize their rule over us to their own people. So they wanted to make a case that there was a requirement of what Kipling called as white man's burden. So book, in some sense, talks about all these things in different chapters, and then also there's a chapter on how India's nationalist leadership also accepts this idea, the colonial idea, and then turns it into a kind of national common sense. And that's how it becomes hegemonic. And in some sense, it's convenient for post-colonial native elites to think of villages and cities like this in terms of hierarchies, in terms of binaries, where village becomes a site of deficit, village becomes a site of ignorance, village becomes a site of backwardness, village becomes a site of underdevelopment, village becomes a site of some kind of orthodoxy. So all of us kind of, in some sense, then immediately attribute all kinds of social ills to our rural being rural, right? So this is very problematic, and this kind of produces policy narratives. This also produces hegemonic common sense for people like us. So we need to engage with the historical and empirical and conceptual questions surrounding settlements.
Right, so you did talk about how there have been livelihoods beyond agriculture in rural society. You talked about technology, different forms of other livelihoods. But we'd like to know from you how they have been impacting the Indian village life, the livelihoods beyond agriculture.
Yeah. So one point that I make over and over again in the book, that we need to completely drop this idea of the Indian village, right? So there is nothing called the Indian village. We know that this subcontinent is ecologically very diverse. Ecological diversity implies that possibilities of economic life varied significantly across regions. Like if you go to Kerala, there's a particular kind of rural life, which is structured around some kind of coconut economy, but also economy of other kinds, high value kind of crops. So once you produce things like spices will produce also other kinds of occupations, right? Dry fruits will produce other kinds of occupations, packaging and stuff like that. Likewise, if you go to Bengal, Bengal has its own history of jute economy. I've not studied Bengal, but then ecologically, it is a region where there's a lot of water, there's a lot of rain, there are other kinds of natural possibilities in that region. Rivers are everywhere. That's why we have such dense population. There's water everywhere. So what we call as caste system or Jajmani relations, they are also not things that have always been there. These relations also evolved historically, and they varied significantly depending on the region, right? So in some areas, for example, it would be very easy for potters to make pots, right? But also, I'm sure there would be regions where pots were imported, right? If there was a lot of rain, it would be very difficult to kind of have that kind of economy. Likewise, if you have leather economy would also depend on kind of animal husbandry you would have in that region. So agriculture also demanded certain kind of technologies which would then help those kinds of cultivations. If you have wheat cultivation region, you need different kind of technology. There is a possibility of irrigation. So one should recognize that there are diverse regional trajectories. And then most importantly, whenever we talk about Indian village in our classroom or we look at literature, we are talking about a typical North Indian or typical plain village, right? So there are fishery villages where you don't have the conventional agriculture. Most people depend on the sea to collect their livelihood. Empirically, we don't know how economies were structured there, what kind of alternative employments were there in fishery rural settlements. Likewise, hills are very different. I mean, I've studied Himachal. Most of the rural settlements are very tiny, and they have sometimes are also single caste rural settlements. Places like Bihar, you have huge rural settlements, or you go to Rajasthan, you have desert areas. Desert areas produce different kinds of economies. You had stone economy, and we hardly have any anthropological work on stone economy. And stone also, like, if you look at the Taj Mahal, where did that stone come from? Stone was being produced, and you have stone economy starting from this region, going to all over the Asian subcontinent, maybe even beyond, right? So what were the links of different regions with different regions? What kind of mercantile activity evolved in different parts of the subcontinent? So I think those are subjects, because we don't identify that as sources of livelihood. We also don't have histories of those occupations. How does leather economy develop in India? When do people begin to kind of have cows? What kind of cows? What kind of leather that cow produced? How was it different from buffalo's leather or goat's leather? And where did these animals come from? And that itself, the pastoral economies were also changing with time. Some communities settled down early. Some communities continued to be dependent on cattle economy. Even in 1980s, when I was doing my field work in these Haryana villages, most of the farmers, from small to big, they kept cattle, and some of them kept in dozens, like 40, 50, and these were mostly milch cattle. But again, with tractors, bullocks become irrelevant, right? Or with new kind of transport system, earlier kind of carriage becomes irrelevant. So we need to see these as dynamic economies. They were not static economies. They were not similar across the subcontinent, but there were different kinds of artisan economies, and these artisan economies were not only for the village. Most important thing is that these artisan economies were global economies in some way or the other, right? And those artifacts were being sold, being exported in whatever way it was, whatever the notion of globe that existed in the world. But likewise, the medicine was, Ayurveda was not a local tradition. Ayurveda was also interacting with Yunan, what we call as Greece these days, and we talk about Unani Ayurveda. And there were other things also, perhaps other kinds of technologies. We know different kinds of food products came to India, began to be cultivated in India. So these were all fluid and dynamic economic processes. They were also cultural processes. They were also part of political processes. And with them, there were also social changes happening. We think of caste system as a static structure, as Varna. That's complete misleading. narrative that we have constructed as social scientists. We talk about caste, but actual structures of relations were closely connected with the kind of economic processes we had.
Right. And we've also been talking about the understanding of the rural as a sign or as a site of deficit. So, why do you think that exists, and what explains that kind of thought process?
No, I think that's a very good question, and that's where we need to, in some sense, speak about it. I mean, the way we are doing now, or the way I've tried to do in the book. So it's partly ignorance, because, for example, nationalist leaders, many of them, all of them actually, they came from urban background, right? Even somebody like Ambedkar was born in a kind of town in Mhow in Madhya Pradesh, and his father was a mobile person. He was already employed in British bureaucracy. If you look at Gandhi or Nehru or all others who at some level begin a narrative of the nation state as a social and cultural reality. So they borrowed these ideas from the colonial narratives, because all of them, or virtually all of them, were educated in the colonial system, right? The kind of Western education that was introduced by Macaulay, and many of them went abroad, mostly to Britain, and studied there. So when Gandhi begins to talk about village in South Africa, that's where he first talks about the village. He had not visited a village in India, right? His family did not come from a village. He talks about village in a very kind of based on colonial narratives, and in some sense in a very objectionable manner. When he comes to India, then he realizes that, villages are very different from what he thought. I mean, I've mentioned this whole chapter on this. Likewise, Nehru's family had always been urban. Right? They were Kashmiris, they were from Srinagar, Kauls, urban. They moved to Delhi, and that's they live close to Nehru, and that's how become Nehru. From Delhi, they go to Allahabad. Now, Srinagar, Delhi, Allahabad, these are all urban centers, right? And they have existed before colonial period. So Nehru had no idea. That's why he very honestly, I mean, in some sense, wrote a book which was Discovery of India. When he talks about India, that he actually says that I did not know about India. So he had to go. But then he also has a kind of condescending attitude towards the rural as kind of backward. So they also are, in some sense, invested in the colonial imagination, but they turn it around. They turn it around and use the colonial narratives to make a case for India's distinctive nationhood, that India has a kind of social unity, India has a cultural unity, India has a common history. And then they kind of turn it into common sense. But most importantly, for people like us, the middle classes are themselves, in some sense, they are imagining their own pasts and futures through the Eurocentric language of progress, right? So we have progress because we have become educated, we are in urban areas, we are mobile, we are going to, and the destination for everyone who is mobile is California or US or Europe. So that's the trajectory. Even now we are talking English language, and to be able to speak in English is something that comes with your education. My book is also published in English because that carries a different kind of weight. We are not even trained in our native languages any longer. So most of us just try to, in some sense, master the language which is global, fine. But at the same time, we should recognize that this also has its own politics. And that's where perhaps the answer to your question lies, that we are invested in this hegemonic narrative. And we are invested because at some level, it also gives us chances to be privileged. And we can, in some sense, then continue with this narrative because it in some sense also helps. But it's also uncritically accepted.
Right. And a related question, how do we understand this question of power in the rural?
So again, I have a whole chapter on this because power is also a central conceptual, what one should say, trope in the literature on rural, right? So you have somebody like, I start that chapter with say Rabindranath Tagore, when he talks about village and city, in an essay that he kind of very fondly published, he talks about village as if village is a kind of feminine space, full of love, full of innocence, full of simplicity. And you go there and you rejuvenate it yourself, like you go home and you have your mother or you have your wife. So there's a kind of very simplistic imagination, which also at some level is seen as free of any kind of power, right? So the actual reality of village was landlordism, and he himself belonged to a landlord family, and he says that, he admits that. But then he sees that landlord identity of his as identity of patronage, through which he would take care of the village, right? So there is no power expected in that. So if you look at actual history of caste or of land relations, we have slavery in India. Caste also is a kind of land relationship which also produces subordination and domination. So power was always there. So the first point is that we should not think of Indian village which has no inequality or no structure of power, subordination and domination, right? And that's how, say, for example, when Marx talks about Indian village, he's also talking about villages being powerless. Or when Dumont talks about caste, he also, in some sense, overemphasizes on question of status, as if status is not power. And he actually says status encompasses power, as if the two are different things. You need to just read Weber to realize that, status is a dimension of power. Class is a dimension of power. Authority is a kind of straightway structure of power. So having said that, you have very interesting literature coming out of village studies, which is beginning to reflect on the nature of power relations, Srinivas' idea of dominant caste. But there are also many others who are actually observing and writing about the kind of relationships that existed between the ruling establishment of the village, which was in South India or in Western India. It was mostly the Brahmin landlords. And on the other extreme were Dalits. In between, they were what we now call as OBCs. And these were power relations. These were agrarian relations, right? Andre Bete talks about his village. He's talking about Harijan Basti and Cheri and Agraharam. And Agraharam is the place where, so Brahmin not only lives in Agraharam, but Brahmin also has a view of the village, which excludes the Dalits, right? Which doesn't even include people living in the Cheri. And this is how village is narrativized as a site where the privileged live, the privileged dominant caste live, and in some sense, even in agrarianly regions which are regions of the so-called dominant castes, they also see village as their village. In Punjab, Haryana, for example, villages are known by caste of the dominant caste. That this is a village of Jats, this is a village of Gujars, this is a village of Rhodes. So these are the people who in some sense exclusively get identified with the rural establishment. So there is also but recognition that there is a kind of dominance, and if there is dominance, there would also be subordinance. Even though Srinivas doesn't talk about relationships, but he's talking about village being a space where you have dominant caste and others. So this rural power structure has been diverse across regions, depending on, as I said, economies and regional political histories and regional trajectories of change, of people coming from outside, people migrating out away from village. So all those things were shaping power relations. And the book talks about in detail how after India's independence, there is a new kind of framework of power, which is the framework of the nation state, right? We have, on the one hand, a democratic political system coming into being, where the elections unleash a new process of imagination about self and the other, about political process, about political power. And also there is a kind of constitutional system that if you have three-tier system, there are panchayats, and these panchayats have to be of a certain nature, with reservations for scheduled castes, later on also reservation for women. And they completely transform the idea of panchayat. The panchayat also, it's a kind of mystic idea which was popularized by Gandhi and others, So we never had any kind of cooperative panchayat, the way in which we understand it. Panchayat used to be panchayats of the dominant caste, and they had their domination over the village. There was village panchayat where people would be called from the non-dominant castes, but they did not have much say. So village was a very unequal place politically, and they were also every village or every part of the village will have a few individual families which would be very powerful. Either they are big landlords or they've otherwise been also powerful. But land was very critical. If you did not own land, there was no way you could be powerful, right? In Haryana, we had Thodedars, or we have in other parts of India, Chaudharis, and there are also names given to them, the Lambardars and all those people, individuals, Patels. These were titles given to them by the local community, but also by the local state. So state systems also varied, and those state systems also produced structures of power. For example, landlordism would require a hierarchy of tax collectors, revenue collectors, and they were given rights. So there was power that evolved from within the village based on some kind of caste inequalities, land ownership patterns, but also power that flowed from outside, from the local state into the village. And this undergoes change with electoral process, introduction of democracy. You have a new kind of, again, trajectories vary significantly across regions. Like we still don't talk about dominant caste in Bengal. The caste dynamics of Bengal are very different from the caste dynamics of Karnataka. When we think of Karnataka, we talk about Pokaligas and Lingayats. There is no parallel caste group in Bengal, right? Or there is no parallel caste group in Uttarakhand. So who are the caste groups that dominate in Uttarakhand? Uttarakhand again is a region where Brahmins are in large numbers, right? Not in Punjab. Punjab has its own dynamics. So we can't really still think of a pan-Indian level, but we still have a new kind of state structuring rural and rural power through the constitutional mandate. And that has some kind of, that brings about some commonality, electoral process, kind of new elite emerges, both at the village level, at the regional level, and now with the state becoming a very important actor which provides welfare schemes. And village is becoming, site of deficit, and therefore lots of welfare. So welfare provision becomes a very major channel through which power travels to the village from the region, right? So there are these new kinds of class of fixers or local political entrepreneurs who are not like Chaudharis. And this is something that I've also studied empirically. Many others have studied. So there's a chapter which kind of looks at this entire journey of how rural power is very different. Its mechanism, its functioning, its dynamics is very different from what it used to be 30 years back, 50 years back, 100 years back. So it's always been changing, but at the same time, diversities continue, even though there are much greater similarities across the nation state because of the national state system.
Right. Thank you for that answer, sir. I think throughout the book, and of course in the interview, you've emphasized how the book talks about the changing realities and also sort of tries to, the question, the dominant narrative which has been in Indian sociology or otherwise. So our closing question to you would be whether you think there exists an alternative approach to studying rural realities.
This book is an alternative approach to studying rural realities. Not that spatial formations are not important, right? We need to recognize that spatiality is significant. Right? But spatiality is a plural process. Instead of working through binaries, my own argument is that we should recognize that there are diverse spatialities, and spatialities are socially and historically produced through political and economic processes, right? So, and that would be my alternative approach, that we look at spatiality as one of the social reality, and along with, say, when we are talking about gender relations are not simply matter of men and women relationship. As they are shaped by economies, they are also shaped by spatialities, right? So the kind of masculinity you would have in agrarian rich regions would be different from the kind of masculinity you'll have in the fishery regions, right? So spatial formations, economic processes, like we talk about urban. Urban is also very diverse, and urban has multiple spatialities, right? Sitting in JNU, you can look around. We just go across from the North Gate. You see in front of you something called Munirka village. On the right hand side, you have Munirka DDA flats. And then on the left hand side, we have Munirka enclave. And in between, there is something else. And you further go left and turn to the left, and you see a big slum, which is called as a Vasant Vihar slum. And slum social structure is very different from the social structure of Munirka enclave or Munirka village, right? Munirka village has also become some kind of slum, but the Munirka village is very different from the slum of Vasant Vihar. Now, Vasant Vihar has this slum where poor people live, but we know Vasant Vihar as the settlement of the elite, where one house was sold for like 96 crores very recently. So you have these kinds of spatial formations existing together, and rural should be seen as a variety rather than, I don't believe in those kind of old American notions of rural-urban continuum. It's not a question of continuum. We need to have typologies, and these typologies would then help us engage with settlements as social and historical processes. That would be the kind of alternative perspective.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for taking time out and talking to us today about your book. And to our viewers, definitely everyone grab a copy. Yes, from the entire Doing Sociology team, thank you once again for talking to us today.
Thank you very much. I think we've talking, it's been taken longer time than we had planned. It's because your questions were so interesting, and I think, thank you.